In the Middle Ages, the sea once did something almost impossible to believe. In a single winter night, it tore open a graveyard, lifted the dead from their graves, and scattered their coffins across the sand. Then it came back for the living and swallowed the whole town. And it was not the only one. All along the coasts of medieval Europe, the sea ate towns alive, great ports, cathedral cities, even a place once called the largest city on the continent. Some vanished in a single night. Others were hunted for 600 years and found beneath the waves exactly where the old legends promised. Today, 10 medieval cities the sea swallowed whole, which were real and which were only legend. Let's begin. Number 10. Kenfig, a walled Norman town on the south coast of Wales that did not drown in water at all. It was buried alive in sand. Picture the coast near Bridgend today. A wide nature reserve of grassy dunes, a quiet lake, skylarks overhead. It looks like a place where nothing has ever happened. But walk out across those dunes and you are walking on the roof of a lost town. Streets, houses, a market, a parish church, a castle keep with walls 14 meters on a side. All of it is still there under your feet, packed in sand up to 30 meters deep. That is the height of a 10-story building, pressing down on a medieval town. Kenfig began as a statement of power. In the early 1100s, soon after the Normans pushed into South Wales, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom raised a castle here. Robert, Earl of Gloucester, the illegitimate son of a king, built a stone keep to hold down conquered land. And around that castle the usual thing happened. A town grew up in its shadow, the way towns always did. By the early 1300s, Kenfig was a proper borough, with something like 140 walled house plots, what the records call burgages. Think of each one as a town center lot, a house facing the street and a workshop and garden behind. There was a church dedicated to St. James. There was a market. There were taxes, courts, and all the ordinary business of a small, prosperous English-speaking town planted on the edge of Wales. And from the very beginning, Kenfig had enemies on two sides. On one side were the Welsh. The town sat on a fault line between Norman lords and the people they had conquered, and the people they had conquered kept coming back for it. Kenfig was attacked, burned, and fought over again and again. 1167. 1183, 1232, 1242, the end of the 1290s, and then in the Great Welsh Rising under Llewellyn Bren around 1316, it was assaulted once more. A town that gets burned that many times and rebuilt every time is a tough town. The people of Kenfig were not quitters, but the enemy on the other side could not be fought. It did not carry torches or swords. It came on the wind. This whole stretch of coast sits beside a wide, shallow sea that throws up enormous quantities of sand, and somewhere in the storms of the later Middle Ages the balance tipped. The dunes began to move. Not in a flood, not in a single night, but slowly, year after year, the wind pushed a slow tide of sand inland off the beach, and it came for Kenfig. Imagine watching it happen across a lifetime. First, the fields at the edge of town stop yielding because there is sand in the soil. Then the sand reaches the outer houses and it does not stop at the walls. It piles against the doors. It pours through the windows. A family shovels their doorway clear in the morning, and by evening it has drifted shut again. One house is abandoned, then the next, then the whole street. And the dune rolls over the empty roofs like a wave that has forgotten how to break. There is no drama. There is just sand and patience, and a town slowly suffocating one house at a time. The people did what people do. They retreated. They gave ground street by street, pulling back toward the higher land until at last the town could not function as a town any longer. By around 1470, Kenfig was finished as a living place. And here is the detail that tells you how completely they gave up on it. They came back for the church. They took their parish church apart, stone by stone, loaded the stones onto carts, and hauled them a few miles east to the village of Pyle, out of the sand's reach. There, Between roughly 1471 and 1485, they built a new church out of the bones of the old one. If you want to see medieval Kenfig today, part of it is standing in the next village over, rebuilt as somebody else's parish. By the time the antiquarian John Leland rode through this coast, around 1539, there was almost nothing left to see. He described a castle nearly in ruin and all but choked and devoured by the sands that the sea casts up. A whole borough gone, and the strangest part of all is what survived. The single highest, strongest thing the Normans ever built here, the great square castle keep, refused to disappear completely. To this day, after everything, the very top of it still pokes up out of the dunes. A few stones of gray masonry breaking the surface of the grass like the back of something drowning very, very slowly. Now, because Kenfig was so completely swallowed, a legend grew up to explain it, the way a legend always does. The story says that Kenfig was a wicked town, and that a curse was laid on it, a voice that cried out, "Vengeance, vengeance," on the 9th generation. And when the 9th generation came, the whole town sank in a single night beneath the waters of a lake. People will tell you that Kenfig Pool, the real lake that sits in the dunes today, is haunted, and that on a still day you can see chimneys standing up through the water, and hear bells ringing far down below. It is a wonderful story, and it is the wrong one. There is a real lake. There is no sunken town beneath it. Kenfig was not drowned in one cursed night by a magic flood. It was buried over generations by wind-driven sand and the slow advance of the sea, a disaster so quiet and so long that the human mind almost refuses to accept it. So people swap the slow truth for a fast legend. A town that vanishes in one night because of a curse is a story you can hold in your head. A town that takes 200 years to choke to death on sand is somehow harder to believe. That is Kenfig, the gentlest killer on our list because sand is patient and gives you time to run. The rest of the sea is not so kind, because Kenfig in the end saved what it could. They carried their church inland and rebuilt it where the sand could never reach. The next town on our list did the exact opposite. It left its church standing right where it was, on the open shore, and let the water close in around it on every side year after year, until that lonely tower was the only thing left of the town at all. Number 9. Eccles, or, to give it its full medieval name, Eccles next the sea. It is a name that became a slow and bitter joke, because Eccles was not next the sea for very long. In the end, the sea moved in, and the village was simply gone, and all that was left of it was one tall church tower standing alone on the open beach, with waves breaking around its feet. But begin where the village began, on solid ground. When William the Conqueror's men rode through Norfolk to make the great survey we call Domesday, around 1086, they found Eccles already here, already old. A working farming village on the east coast, with something like 2,000 acres of land. Think of a small market town's worth of fields and pasture and common, ditched and plowed and grazed by ordinary people who had worked this same ground for generations before anyone wrote it down. At the heart of it stood the parish church, dedicated to St. Mary, the building that held the village together. Weddings, funerals, harvests, the ringing of the bell on a Sunday morning. This was a place that expected to last forever, the way villages always do. And it was, by the measure of its world, a real place, not a hamlet of a few huts. 2,000 acres is a great deal of land. Picture the whole green stretch of it, the strips of plowland running down toward the coast, the common where the sheep and cattle grazed, the muddy lanes between the houses, the smoke from the cooking fires drifting inland on the sea wind. Children were christened in St. Mary's font, and old men were buried in its yard, generation after generation, until the churchyard held more of the village than the village did. None of these people had any reason to think they were living in a doomed place. To them, it was simply home, on a coast that had always been there and always would be. And for a long time it nearly did. Eccles sat behind a line of sand dunes, a low wall of grass and sand thrown up between the fields and the North Sea. Those dunes were the only thing standing between the village and the open water. As long as they held, Eccles was safe. The trouble was that the sea was not patient and the sea did not stop. Year after year, storm after storm, the North Sea leaned against that coast and took it, a little at a time. A field at the edge would go, then a few yards of dune, then a few more. There was no single enemy you could point to, no army at the gate. There was only the water coming a fraction closer every winter and the slow, grinding certainty that it would never give the land back. You have to understand how slow this was, and how that slowness was its own kind of cruelty. A man born in Eccles might plow a field his whole life and pass it to his son, and that son might plow it for 30 years more before the dune behind it finally failed, and the salt water came across it for good. No single generation could point to the year the village began to die, because no single generation watched it die. They each saw only their own small loss, a corner of common ground here, a track that used to run to the shore and now ran into the surf. Set the losses end to end across centuries, though, and you are watching an entire parish being carried out to sea one cartload of soil at a time. It is the kind of disaster that is almost invisible while it is happening and undeniable only when it is finished. So the people of Eccles fought the only fight they could, which was the fight of retreat. They gave ground. Acre by acre, the parish shrank, the sea eating into the fields from the seaward side while the families pulled their lives back toward what high ground was left. And somewhere in this long defeat comes the turning point that tells you they knew the village was dying. In 1571, they took the village down. Not the sea this time, but the people themselves, dismantling buildings that could no longer be defended, because there was no longer a village left worth the keeping. A community taking its own home apart, board by board, ahead of the water, is not a community that expects to win. Then came the storm. In 1604, a ferocious gale drove the North Sea straight over what was left of the dunes and into the heart of the parish. This particular storm sits just the wrong side of the Middle Ages, a little too late to be truly medieval, but it did not invent the disaster. It only finished a disaster that had been running for 500 years. Eccles had been a Domesday village the sea spent centuries devouring. The storm simply took the last large bite. And we know almost exactly how much was left, because the survivors wrote it down, not as a record but as a plea. The year after the Great Storm, in 1605, the people of Eccles petitioned the crown for relief from their taxes. They could not pay, they said, because there was almost nothing left to tax. By their own account, the whole parish had been reduced to 14 houses and about 300 acres of land. Remember that this had once been a village of 2,000 acres. So roughly 85 out of every 100 acres of Eccles had gone into the sea. Picture that petition for a moment. A handful of families, 14 households, standing in the wreckage of a village that Domesday had counted 400 years before, putting their names to a piece of paper that says, in effect, "We are nearly gone. Please ask us for less." It is one of the saddest documents a drowning town ever left behind, a paper trail of a place watching itself vanish. There is something almost unbearable in the smallness of that number. 14 houses. You could stand in the middle of what was left of Eccles and count every roof that remained and reach 14 and be done. A village that had fed and buried its people since before the Norman conquest had been reduced to a figure a child could hold up on 2 hands and 4 fingers. And the request itself was so modest, so humble. They did not ask the crown to save them or to fight the sea on their behalf, because they knew that nobody could. They asked only to be charged a little less for the privilege of drowning slowly. There is no grander monument to the death of Eccles than that quiet, defeated piece of paper. After that, Eccles as a living village was finished. But the church tower would not go, And this is the part of the story that is genuinely hard to believe. St. Mary's Tower stood up out of the sand and water, and it kept standing. The lower part of it was round, the upper part eight-sided where the bells had hung, and as the land around it was stripped away, the tower was simply left behind, marooned. For something like 300 years, this lonely tower stood out on the open beach, below the high-water line, with the tide washing in and out around its base. Sailors used it. They had no choice but to find a use for it. So a wrecked church became a sea mark, a landmark to steer by, the last service the village of Eccles ever performed for the living. People came to call it the Lonely Sentinel, a single gray tower keeping its watch on an empty shore where a whole parish used to be. It stood for 3 centuries on that beach. And then, on the 23rd of January 1895, in the middle of a hard winter, the Lonely Sentinel finally came down. The tower that had outlived its entire village by hundreds of years, that had survived the storm that killed the parish and 300 years of tides after it, at last gave way and fell onto the sand. And even that was not quite the end. The sea, which had spent so long burying Eccles, every so often digs it back up. The shifting sands have laid the old village bare again and again, in 1862, in 1947, in the early 1990s. And what comes up out of the beach is not just stone and broken wall. In 1992, the scouring tide uncovered human bones, the dead of medieval Eccles, surfacing on the sand where their churchyard used to be. They were gathered up and carried inland and buried again, at the village of Hempstead, the way the lost so often are. To this day, after a big storm and a low tide, a walker on that beach can come across the dark stumps of old walls and worked stone, the bones of the village itself, breaking the surface for a few hours before the sand swallows them once more. There is no grand legend here, no curse, no town that sank in a single cursed night. The truth about Eccles is plainer and somehow heavier than any legend. It is just a village, an ordinary working village as old as Domesday, that the sea took apart over 500 years, acre by acre, house by house, until the only thing left standing was its church, alone on the beach, and the only record of its life was a tax petition begging for mercy. The slow disasters are the ones the mind refuses to hold, so we tend to forget them. Eccles asks to be remembered exactly as it was. Eccles kept its church standing on the open shore until the very end, a lonely tower watching the sea. But the next town did something stranger still. Its drowned church did not just vanish. It waited, just below the surface like a trap, until one summer afternoon 5 centuries later, it reached up out of the water and tore the bottom out of a steamship full of holiday-makers. Number 8. Shipden. Off the coast of Norfolk, at a town called Cromer, there is a holiday beach. People come for the pier, the crab boats, the ice cream, the long flat sands. It is a cheerful, ordinary English seaside town, the kind of place a family goes for a day out. And about 150 yards east of the end of Cromer Pier, just under the water, there is the broken stump of a medieval church. It is the last tooth of a town the sea ate alive. The town was called Shipden, and once it stood where the waves now break. Shipden was never grand. It was small and it was old. When the Domesday Survey counted England in the years after the conquest, it found Shipden already here, a working fishing town of about 117 people, with 4.5 plow teams turning the soil behind the dunes. That is a small place by any measure. Picture one street, perhaps two, a scatter of low cottages, smoke from the cooking fires, fishing nets hung to dry, a couple of dozen families who all knew each other and had known each other for generations. The manor belonged to the abbot of St. Benet's, the great Fenland monastery that held land all across this coast. So these fishermen were tenants of a monk, their rents and their fish owed to an abbey miles inland. There was a harbor where the boats came in with the morning catch. And there was a church, dedicated to St. Peter, the fisherman, the patron saint of men who go out onto the water and do not always come back. It was a fitting saint for a town like this, a town whose whole life faced the sea and whose whole livelihood was pulled out of it. A few hundred souls, some boats, a church on the shore, the abbot's rents collected every year. Nothing about it was meant to last forever, and nothing about it did. Because this stretch of the Norfolk coast is some of the softest, hungriest coast in all of England. It is not hard rock that throws the waves back. It is loose cliff, sand and clay and crumbling earth, and the North Sea gnaws at it without stopping, the way water gnaws at a sandcastle when the tide comes in. Every storm takes a little more. A cliff edge slumps in the night. A field is smaller in the spring than it was in the autumn. A path that used to run along the shore is suddenly hanging in the air, then gone. And all through the 1300s, the sea came for Shipden exactly the way it comes for everything along this coast. Not in one great wave, not in a single famous night, but mouthful by mouthful, year after year, patient and tireless, eating the land out from under the town while the town tried to go on living. You can watch it happen in the records, and the records are heartbreaking in their plainness. By 1336, part of the churchyard of St. Peter was already gone. Think about what that means. The graves were going into the sea. The dead of Shipden, the fishermen and their wives and their children, buried in the ground beside their church, were being washed out of it. And the living understood exactly what was coming. They did the sensible, mournful thing. They bought land further inland, safely back from the cliff, to build a replacement church for the day the old one would be lost. That replacement still stands. It is the parish church of Cromer today, the tall one you can see from the beach. The whole modern town of Cromer is, in a quiet way, Shipden's lifeboat, the place the town climbed up to when the sea finally took its home. And take it the sea did, slowly then completely. Through the late 1300s, house by house and street by street, Shipden gave way to the water. By the time Henry IV wore the crown in the years around 1400, the town of Shipden was simply gone, washed away, off the map. Where there had been a harbor and a fishing town and a church to St. Peter, there was open gray sea. The abbot of St. Benet's had a manor that no longer existed. The fishermen had moved up the hill to Cromer. And that, for 500 years, was the end of the story. A small medieval town, drowned and forgotten, the way the sea drowns and forgets so many along this coast. Except the sea had not quite finished with Shipden, because not everything went down evenly. The Church of St. Peter had a tower, a solid medieval tower built of flint set in mortar, the strongest thing in the whole town. And when the rest of Shipden dissolved into the sea, the tower did not dissolve. It stayed. It stood on the seabed, drowned but unbroken, with its top rising to within about 20 feet of the surface. Local fishermen knew it was there. They had a name for the dark mass that snagged their nets and lurked just under the waves. They called it Church Rock. It is believed to be the Tower of St. Peter's, the last standing piece of Shipden, holding its position on the floor of the sea like a drowned man who refuses to lie down. That identification is strong tradition, backed up by later divers who found masonry on the spot, but it has never been absolutely proven. Still, the name they gave it tells you what everyone always believed: Church Rock, the rock that used to be a church. And then comes the strangest thing that ever happened to Shipden, the thing that makes this little fishing town worth remembering at all. It is the 8th of August, 1888, a summer's day. Cromer is a fashionable Victorian resort now, and one of the pleasures of a Victorian holiday is a trip on a paddle steamer, a day cruise along the coast and back. On this day, a paddle steamer called the Victoria is out on the water, carrying around 100 holiday makers, ordinary day trippers in their summer clothes, out for an afternoon on the sea. And the Victoria, churning along just off Cromer Pier, runs straight into something solid hidden under the waves. She strikes Church Rock. She rams the drowned Tower of St. Peter's, the medieval church of a town that had been underwater for 500 years, and she is wrecked on it. Picture it. A boatload of Victorian trippers, parasols, and bowler hats suddenly aground and hold on a 14th-century church spire they cannot even see. It is a collision across 5 centuries. A pleasure steamer of the modern age, brought to a stop by the bell tower of a medieval fishing town. Everyone aboard the Victoria was rescued. Not a soul was lost. The day trippers went home with a story they would tell for the rest of their lives, about the church that rose out of the sea and wrecked their boat. But the authorities were not in the mood for stories. A drowned church that could sink a passenger steamer was not a curiosity. It was a hazard, a hidden reef with a name and a history, sitting in a busy holiday seaway. And so Trinity House, the body that guards the safety of England's coastal waters, made its decision and carried it out. They brought dynamite to Church Rock. They lowered their charges down onto the last standing tower of Shipden, the Tower of St. Peter's, the final piece of a medieval town, and they blew it up. They dynamited the drowned church, broke it apart on the seabed, and scattered it so that no ship would ever find it again. Sit with that for a moment. A church that had already been under the sea for 500 years was still standing tall enough and solid enough to wreck a steamer full of people. It had survived being drowned. It had outlasted the entire town that built it. The abbot of St. Benet's was 7 centuries gone. The fishermen of Shipden were dust. The very streets were forgotten. And still the Tower of St. Peter held its ground beneath the waves, dangerous to the living long after its own world had ended. It took Victorian gunpowder to do what 500 years of the North Sea could not. The sea took the town. It took the harbor, the houses, the graveyard, the people. But the church it could only drown. It took men, in the end, to finally bring it down. When divers went looking on the spot in the 1980s, they found what was left. 3 pieces of old masonry, rounded beach flints set in mortar, lying in a line running east to west, the way a church always lies, with its altar to the east. That is all that remains now of Shipden above the seabed. A few broken flints in the dark, pointing the way a 1,000-year-old church once faced the rising sun. People sometimes call it the Atlantis off Cromer, but that is only modern color for what is, in truth, a far simpler and far sadder thing. A small fishing town that the sea ate, slowly, completely, and then refused to let rest. Shipden was only ever a small fishing town, dangerous in death but humble in life. The next place the sea took was the opposite in every way. It was one of the greatest ports in all of England. A town so rich and so important to the crown that when the ocean finally swallowed it, the King of England did something almost unheard of. He built an entirely new town from nothing to take its place. Number 7. Old Winchelsea. There is a stretch of the Sussex coast, near the little hill town that carries the name today, where the sea comes and goes over flat marsh and shingle, and there is nothing much to look at. Just water and gray light and the long line of the waves. But somewhere out there under the cold water of Rye Bay lies the wreck of one of the great ports of medieval England. Not a fishing village, not a quiet market town. A genuine sea power, rich and crowded and proud, that the ocean tore to pieces in a handful of winters and never gave back. Old Winchelsea was a sink port. To understand what that meant, picture a chartered town that the crown leaned on for its navy and its trade at the same time. The sink ports were a small group of coastal towns along this corner of England that supplied the king with ships and sailors whenever he needed a fleet, and in return they were granted special rights and freedoms denied to ordinary places. Lower taxes, their own courts, a standing in the kingdom far above their size. Winchelsea was one of the proudest of them, what the records call an antient town, and it sat right at the front rank. And the front rank is not an exaggeration. There is a tax record from the year 1204, the pipe roll, that lets us measure these things in cold figures of money owed to the crown. By that account, Old Winchelsea stands as roughly the 10th most important port in all of England. Think about that for a moment. Out of every harbor on every coast of the whole country, This one town ranked near the very top. To feel the weight of it, set it beside its neighbor Rye, just along the coast. Rye was a real port in its own right, no small place, and yet Winchelsea outranked it many times over, paying the king something close to 6 times what Rye paid. This was not a town living in anyone's shadow. The smaller places lived in its. Now picture the town itself in its prime in the middle of the 1200s. By some accounts it held around 700 houses, packed in close above the water, street running into street. By some accounts it had 50 inns and taverns, or even more, and that one detail tells you everything about the kind of place it was. A town with that many drinking houses is a town full of sailors and merchants and strangers stepping off the boats, a town that never quite goes to sleep, a town where money changes hands at every hour. There were 2 churches lifting their towers over the roofs. There were thousands of people living their whole lives within the sound of the sea. And down at the waterfront the wine came in. Winchelsea was deep in the Gascon wine trade, the great river of barrels that flowed up from the vineyards of southwestern France into thirsty England. Wine ships from Bordeaux crossed the channel and unloaded on its quays. Picture the scene on the wharves, barrels rolling down the gangplanks, carts waiting, tallymen counting, the smell of salt and tar and spilled wine hanging over the whole harbor. This was one of the doorways through which French wine entered England, and a great deal of it came ashore right here. The town grew fat on it. Old Winchelsea was a place of full warehouses and busy quays and ringing church bells, a place that must have felt, to the people who lived there, as permanent and solid as anything in the world. But the very thing that made Old Winchelsea rich was also the thing that doomed it. It was built low, out on the shingle, almost down in the sea's own reach. And in front of it lay a long bank of pebbles, a natural shingle barrier that stood between the town and the open water like a wall the sea itself had piled up. For as long as that wall held, Winchelsea was safe behind it. And somewhere around the middle of the century, around 1250, that wall began to fail. The shingle barrier was breached. The sea found a way in. After that, it was a slow execution by storm. Year upon year, decade upon decade, the surges came in further than they used to, and bit off a little more of the town each time. The people would have known exactly what was happening to them. They would have measured the loss in flooded cellars and gnawed away streets, in houses that stood on the edge one winter and were simply gone the next. But knowing did not save them, because what was coming for Old Winchelsea was far bigger than any wall they could raise against it. It came in the storms of 1287 and 1288. These were not ordinary winter gales. They were among the most violent storms the medieval North Sea ever flung at this coast, and they reshaped the whole region in a single furious season. The decisive blow fell in February of 1287. A great storm surge came up out of the dark. The sea heaped higher than anyone had seen it, and it went through Old Winchelsea as if the town had never been built there at all. Imagine that night, the wind screaming in off the water, the shingle barrier already broken, no longer holding anything back, the surge rising in the streets, lifting boats and barrels, pouring into the taverns and the warehouses and the 2 churches alike. Walls down. Houses swept off their plots. The streets where the wine had rolled now running with seawater, and people scrambling for higher ground while the sea took the place street by street. When the storm finally fell quiet, much of the town was simply not there any longer. That February the town was, for all practical purposes, destroyed. And here is the true measure of that storm, in the wreckage it left scattered up and down the whole coast. The same storm system tore part of the castle at Hastings clean off its cliff and dropped it into the sea. It choked the harbor of New Romney with so much mud and shingle that the town was left stranded inland, marooned away from the water that had been its entire reason to exist. And it did something that is almost beyond belief. It seized hold of an entire river, the Rother, and shifted its course, driving it to carve out a new mouth at Rye. The tide that winter was pushed some 8 miles inland, all the way up to Appledore. One weather system rewrote the rivers and redrew the coastline of a whole corner of England. And old Winchelsea simply happened to be standing in its path. What happened next is the part that tells you how completely the town was gone. There was no rebuilding it. There was nothing left to rebuild and nowhere safe to do it. So instead, King Edward I did something extraordinary. Rather than patch up the ruin, he decided to start again from nothing, on safe ground, and build a whole new Winchelsea from a clean sheet of paper. This was not the slow accident of a town that simply spreads and grows over the years. It was deliberate, designed, planned in advance. On higher land at a place called Iham Hill, well above the reach of the sea, the king chartered a brand new town, laid out on a regular grid of streets like squares ruled across a board. The charter was granted in 1281, and within a few years people were moving in. It stands as one of the very earliest pieces of deliberate town planning in all of England, an early experiment in drawing a whole town out on paper before a single stone was set in the ground. And the men who laid it out are even remembered by name. Henry Llewellys and Thomas Allard mapped the streets and the plots. At the heart of their new town, they raised a fresh parish church, dedicated to St. Thomas Becket. That replacement town is the Winchelsea that still stands on its hill today, small and quiet, with its careful grid of streets and its great church, a planned town that outlived the port it was built to replace. And that is the strange double life of this place. There are, in a sense, two Winchelseas. There is the one you can walk through up on the hill, planned and dry and safe, aging gently through the centuries. And there is the old one, the great Cinque Port, the rich one with its 700 houses and its 50 taverns and its wine quays and its 2 churches and its thousands of souls. And that one is simply not there anymore. It lies somewhere out under the shifting water of Rye Bay, with no tower breaking the surface, no ruin to walk around, nothing at all to mark the spot. The sea did not merely damage old Winchelsea. It erased it so utterly that a king of England found it easier to plan and build a second town than to repair the first. The waves close over it now without a trace, as though the busiest port on this coast had never been there at all. Winchelsea was a town the sea destroyed by accident, in a blind fury of storms. The next place on our list drowned for a very different reason. The water that swallowed it was let in on purpose by human hands as an act of war. Men took axes to their own seawalls and used the ocean itself as a weapon. Number 6. The drowned land of Saeftinghe. This one is different from the others, and you should know that from the start. Most of the towns on this list were killed by the sea, slowly or suddenly, but always by water doing what water does. Saeftinghe was killed by men. The sea opened the door, but it was human hands that pushed it through. Picture the country first. The mouth of a great river, the Scheldt, where the water spreads out wide and flat toward the North Sea, on the border of what is now the Netherlands and Belgium. This is some of the lowest land in Europe. Stand anywhere in it and the horizon is a perfect level line, the sky enormous, the ground so flat that the sea, when it wants to, can simply walk across it. This is land that has to be argued out of the water and held there by force. The people who lived here did not find dry ground waiting for them. They made it. They built earthen banks, what the Dutch call dikes, long walls of packed clay that hold the sea out the way a cupped hand holds back a tide. Behind those banks they pumped and drained the marsh until it was firm enough to walk on, and then they planted fields on the floor of what had been the sea. A piece of farmland reclaimed from the water and kept dry behind a dike has its own name. It is a polder, and the land of Saeftinghe was a polder, won from the sea field by field, a victory of patient men over the tide. Which is exactly why what happened to it later is so bitter. Once it was dry, it was rich, astonishingly rich. This was not some poor fishing hamlet clinging to a sandbank. Saeftinghe was a whole district of fat, productive country, and people had been working it since the 1200s. A castle was raised here in 1279, hard stone planted in soft ground, a sign that this was land worth holding and worth defending, land somebody thought would still be standing in 100 years. Several settlements grew up across the polder, real villages with names and churches and market days and generations of people born and buried in them. And much of the district answered to the great abbey of Tur Dost. Picture the monks of that abbey out among the dikes in their plain robes, walking the fields, keeping the accounts, organizing the labor the way the medieval church so often did, turning raw swamp into ordered grain. The abbey took its share, and the share was generous because Saeftinghe paid. And there was more than grain to be had here. The ground itself was money. Beneath the fields lay thick beds of peat, half-rotted bog laid down over thousands of years, and the people dug it out and stacked it and dried it and burned it for fuel, the same way a later age would burn coal. Peat was warmth. Peat was the fire under the cooking pot through a cold, wet winter, and there was a fortune of it lying just below the grass. And there was salt. In the saltwater marshes along the edge of the polder, the people boiled the brine down in great pans until the water was gone and the white crystals were left behind. And salt, in the Middle Ages, was very nearly as good as silver. We forget that now because salt is the cheapest thing in the kitchen. But before refrigeration, salt was how you kept meat through a winter and fish through a long sea voyage. Salt was survival, and survival, then as now, was something people would pay almost anything for. So Saeftinghe had it all: grain from the fields, fuel from the ground, salt from the marsh, and the broad river right there to carry every bit of it away to market. Trade flowed up and down the Scheldt, and the wealth flowed back. Saeftinghe grew into one of the richest corners of the whole region. If you stood here in its golden years and turned slowly around, you would have seen prosperous villages and busy fields and laden boats stretching away toward that endless flat horizon. And you would have thought, surely, beyond any doubt, that a place this fat and this established would last forever. The people thought so too, and out of that pride grew a story the way pride always does. They told a tale that the houses of Saeftinghe were so wealthy that the doorsteps were made of gold. Now, that is a legend, and you should hear it as a legend, the kind of thing people say about a place when they want to remember how fine it once was. But there is a darker half to the story, and the darker half is the one that the land seemed to come true. It was said that a merman was caught in these waters, and before he was let go he gave a warning, a curse and a prophecy in one breath. The lands of Saeftinghe would fall, he said. Only its towers would stand tall. The people were warned, the story goes, by salt water rising in a freshwater well, an omen of what was coming. They did not listen. They went on counting their wealth, and the sea began to keep the merman's promise. The first great blow came on the 1st of November, 1570. It is remembered as the All Saints' Flood because it fell on All Saints' Day, when the whole Low Country should have been at prayer. A storm drove the North Sea up the Scheldt and threw it against the dikes, and somewhere in the dark the walls gave way, and the water came pouring in across the polder and would not leave. Most of the land of Saeftinghe drowned that single day. The fields the people had argued out of the sea were handed straight back to it in a few black hours. Imagine the morning after, the survivors on the high ground looking out over what had been their whole world, and seeing only gray water where the farms had been, fence posts and rooftops standing up out of the flood like the masts of sunken ships. And the water did not simply rush in and drain away again. It spread and it lingered and it kept coming, reaching deeper into the country with each passing year, as far as what is now Belgium in the time that followed. The Golden Land was already half a memory, half a marsh. But the sea, for once, did not finish the job. Men did. Because all of this was happening inside a war. The 80 Years' War, the long, grinding struggle of the Dutch to tear themselves free of the Spanish crown. And the great Spanish army was closing in on the city of Antwerp, just upriver, in one of the most famous sieges of the age. The Dutch fighters needed to slow that army, to choke its supply lines, to drown the ground the enemy would have to cross. And they looked at what was left of Saeftinghe, that broken, half-flooded, formerly golden land, and they made a cold decision. In 1584, Dutch troops went to the last dike still holding back the sea, the final clay wall keeping the heart of the district dry, the one defense the storms had not yet broken, and they cut it open on purpose. Think hard about what that sentence means. These were not the Spanish. This was not the enemy come to punish a rebel land. This was Saeftinghe's own side, the men fighting for the very freedom of these very lands, and they took up their tools and deliberately let the sea in to drown one of the wealthiest districts of the whole region with their own hands, as a weapon of war. There is a name for this kind of thing. When an army destroys its own ground so the enemy can find nothing to use, when it burns its own crops and poisons its own wells and leaves the advancing soldiers nothing but ash and hunger, we call it scorched earth. Saeftinghe was scorched earth, only the scorching was done with salt water instead of fire. The dike was opened, the North Sea walked back in through the gap, and a land that had taken 300 years of patient labor to win was given away to the tide in an afternoon on purpose to slow an army on its way to Antwerp. The flood that finished Saeftinghe was not sent by God. It was not sent by a storm. It was ordered by men. And it was opened by a spade and a few hard strokes of an axe against a wall of clay. And that was the end. The land never came back. Other places on this list were rebuilt or mourned or argued about for centuries. Saeftinghe was simply surrendered to the tide and left there. The dikes were never rebuilt across most of it. The water settled in and made itself at home, and the fields and villages and golden doorsteps, if there ever were any, went down into the mud and stayed. So what is there now, where one of the wealthiest districts in the region used to lie? Wilderness. Today the drowned land of Saeftinghe is the largest brackish tidal marsh in all of Europe, a vast maze of salt creeks and mudflats and reed where the river water and the sea water mix, twice a day with the tides. Seabirds wheel over it. Seals haul out on its banks. Where there were once farmers and monks and salt boilers and the busy noise of a rich country, there is now only the hiss of wind in the reeds and the slow breathing of the tide. The merman, the legend says, got his wish. The land of Saeftinghe fell, and there is nobody left to argue with him. Saeftinghe was a single rich district, drowned by the choices of men. But 3 centuries before those soldiers cut their dike, the sea had shown what it could do entirely on its own, in one night, on a scale almost beyond imagining. It broke into the heart of the Low Countries, swallowed a whole coastline and tens of thousands of lives, and when the water finally settled, the map of the Netherlands had a vast new sea in the middle of it that had not been there the day before. Number 5. Griend and the night the sea ate a country. To understand what happened here, you first have to understand the country it happened to. The medieval Low Countries were not built on safe ground. This was a flat, soft, waterlogged land, much of it lying lower than the sea that pressed against it, held back only by long banks of packed earth called dikes. Picture a wall of mud and turf standing between a quiet field of grazing cattle and a gray, restless sea that sits higher than the field itself. That is what these people lived behind, every day of their lives. And where there were no dikes, people did the only other thing they could. They built up. All across this drowned-looking land they raised terps, artificial mounds of earth heaped up by hand over generations, and they set their houses and their churches on top of them. A terp was a way of lifting your whole home above the reach of the water, a small dry island you made yourself, so that when the floods came you would still be standing above them. Think of it as building your own little hill, basket of earth by basket of earth, year after year, until your house and your barn and your church all sat on a raised dry crown above the marsh, and the floods could only lap at the foot of it. The people here had been fighting the sea for so long that they had learned to live like that, perched on little hills of their own making, surrounded by water that wanted in. It was a slow, patient kind of survival, a whole society arranged around the simple fact that the water was always there, always pressing, always a little higher than they would have liked. They knew the sea flooded. They expected it to flood. What they did not know, what no one could have known, was that one night the sea would not come as a flood at all. It would come as something closer to the end of the world. Out in this watery world sat Griend. It was a small place, but it was a real one. There was a walled settlement here, and a monastery, monks living and praying on a low scrap of land between the marshes and the open sea. It was the kind of community that the rest of this story will speak for, an ordinary medieval place going about its ordinary business, with no idea that it was about to become the face of one of the worst nights in the history of the North Sea. That night came in the deep cold of the year. The 13th and 14th of December, 1287, the Feast of St. Lucia, one of the longest, darkest nights on the whole calendar. Out at sea, a great storm rolled in off the North Sea and drove the water ahead of it, the way a strong wind can pile water up at the far end of a bathtub. This is what a storm surge is. The sea heaped into a moving wall and shoved hard against the land. It is not the slow rise of a tide. It is a mountain of water arriving all at once, pushed by the wind, far higher than the sea has any right to be. It came against the dikes in the dark, rising and rising. Imagine the people on those terps that night, hearing it before they could see it, the wind tearing at the thatch, the water climbing the dikes outside in the blackness. And then it overtopped them. Water poured across the top of the banks that had held it back for generations, spilling over in cold sheets onto the dry land behind. And once the water was over the top, it began to eat the dike itself from the wrong side, gouging away at the earth, until the bank that had stood for lifetimes simply gave way. The land barrier collapsed, and the sea came in. What followed was not a flood the way we usually imagine one. It was the sea taking back a whole country at once. The water poured into the low Frisian land, across the fields and the villages and the terps, and there was nowhere for it to go and nothing to stop it. It did not rise gently around people's ankles and give them time to climb to safety. It came in a black rush across flat country in the dead of a winter night, and where it found a house, it took the house, and where it found a sleeping village, it took the village. Griend was all but wiped from the earth. The walls, the settlement, the monastery, the monks at their prayers, almost all of it was gone by morning. When it was over, the chronicles say that just 10 houses were left standing on it. 10 houses out of a whole walled town. Hold that picture for a moment. Not a town damaged, not a town flooded, but a town reduced to 10 houses, with gray water moving where the rest of it had stood the day before. Across the wider country it was the same story, town after town gone under, and the survivors who lived through it did so by clinging to their terps, those hand-built mounds suddenly the only land left above the water. Picture them, at first light, crowded onto a few small hills in the middle of a sea that had not been there the night before, with no boat and no help coming, watching cold open water stretch to the horizon where their fields and their neighbors had been. They had built those mounds against exactly this. On that one night, the mounds were the only reason anyone was alive at all. The dead are harder to count, and here we have to be honest. Around 30 East Frisian villages were lost. As for the people, the medieval chronicles claimed a staggering number, tens of thousands drowned in a single night, perhaps as many as 50 to 80,000, which would make it one of the deadliest floods ever recorded. But those are the chroniclers speaking, and medieval chroniclers were not careful with numbers the way we would want them to be. The honest thing to say is this: tens of thousands of people died, that much is real, and the higher figures are what the records claimed, not something we can stand behind. The horror does not need the exact number. Whatever the true figure, it was a catastrophe on a scale that is hard to hold in the mind, A whole landscape of people who went to sleep behind their dikes on an ordinary winter evening and did not wake up. And then there is the part that makes this night different from almost any other on this list. Most of our drowned towns lost a town. This one lost a coastline. When the dikes failed and the sea swept in, it did not simply flood the land and then drain away. It found a string of inland freshwater lakes, gentle bodies of fresh water sitting in the heart of the low country, and it broke through to them and joined them to the open sea. In one storm, that fresh water turned to salt, and that scattered chain of lakes became a single vast inland sea. This was the birth of the Zuiderzee, a great arm of salt water reaching deep into the country. Where there had been farmland and freshwater fishing one week, there was open salt sea the next, with tides and storms of its own, biting further inland with every gale. A single night had redrawn the map of the Netherlands, the way a new map gets drawn over an old one, erasing the old shoreline and inking in a new and far larger sea where solid land and quiet lakes had been the day before. And that sea would not go away. It would shape the country, its trade and its towns and its long, slow war against the water for the next 7 centuries. There is one small mercy in the story, and it is worth holding onto because it tells you exactly why everyone else died. West Friesland survived, not by luck and not by miracle, but because it already had a ring dike around it, a complete loop of defenses enclosing the whole district, with no weak point for the sea to overtop and tear open. The places that drowned because their walls had a top the water could climb over and a flank it could rip apart. The place that lived because its wall had no end. The sea did not spare the gentle or the good. It spared the well-defended and took everyone else. That is the lesson the Low Countries carried out of that December night and never forgot. The sea is not an enemy you can frighten away or pay off or wait out. It simply presses, every hour of every day, against whatever you have built, and it only needs to find one weakness, one place where the wall is low or thin, on one bad night when the wind is wrong. Griend learned that with 10 houses left standing on it, a handful of survivors out on their terps, looking across cold new water at a country that had changed shape while they were trying to stay alive. On the night the Zuiderzee was born, the sea killed on a scale no army ever matched. But cruelty is not only about numbers. Back across the water on the coast of England, a single lawless little boomtown was about to suffer something so grotesque, so personal, that a monk would feel compelled to write it down by hand, so that no one would ever forget what the sea had done to the dead. Number 4. Ravenser Odd. The last town did not drown. This one did the opposite of everything you would expect. It did not sink into the sea. It rose out of it. Picture the mouth of the Humber on the Yorkshire coast, near the long sandspit we now call Spurn Head. This is one of the most restless coastlines in all of England. The North Sea throws its sand south along this shore the way it has for thousands of years, piling it into banks and bars that the tide reshapes overnight, dragging the whole edge of the land first one way and then the other. Nothing here stays put for very long. And somewhere in the early part of the 13th century, against all the odds, one of those banks held. The sea heaped up a low island of sand and shingle off the point, just above the reach of the high tide. It should have stayed an empty bar, a bare hump of wet ground where gulls landed and nothing else, a thing the next big storm would scatter again. Instead, people looked at it and people built a town on it. They gave it an Old Norse name, Hrafn's Point, or near enough, with the word odd on the end, meaning the spit, the tip of land that juts out into the water. Ravenser Odd, a town standing on a bank of sand that the sea itself had only just finished making. And it did not just survive there. It boomed. This is the part that is hard to believe, so hold on to it. Within a few short generations, this town on a sandbank became one of the busiest little ports on the east coast of England. Think of a gold rush boomtown thrown up overnight on the edge of nowhere, all noise and money, and people arriving faster than anyone can count them. Except this one was thrown up on ground that had not even existed a lifetime before. By the end of the 13th century, Ravenser Odd had more than 100 houses standing on its bank of sand. It had a market where farmers and traders haggled, and wharves where ships tied up to unload. It had a court of its own, where the town judged its own disputes, and a prison to go with it, to hold those it found guilty. The customs men there took their dues from more than 100 ships a year, every one of them paying for the right to trade through this upstart little port, and the king himself recognized it. On the 1st of April, 1299, Edward I granted Ravenser Odd a borough charter. In plain terms, that was a royal license to run itself as a proper town, with its own market and its own freedoms, signed and sealed by the crown. It is the kind of document a king did not give to a sandbar. He gave it to a place that mattered. It went further than that. 4 years before the charter, in 1295, Ravenser Odd was important enough to send 2 members to the great model parliament that Edward called that year. 2 men, riding off from a town on a sandbank to sit among the lords and burgesses of England and help speak for the realm. That is how seriously this place was taken. And it had a reputation, too, and not a clean one. Ravenser Odd was a wild, half-lawless place, a port full of sailors and chancers and hard men, and it was notorious for piracy. Its people had a trick that made them rich and made them hated. Ships were supposed to sail further up the Humber to do their business at the older ports. The men of Ravenser Odd would go out, meet those ships at the mouth of the river, and steer them into their own wharves instead, by persuasion or by force, taking the trade and the travelers whether they wanted to come or not. For a while it simply outmuscled its bigger neighbor upstream, the town of Hull, snatching away ships and tolls that Hull believed were its own by right. Picture that. A few decades after the first house went up on an empty sandbank, the town on the sandbank was robbing one of the great ports of the north of its business and getting away with it. The boomtown on the bar was winning. Now a quick word about a neighbor, because the names get tangled and it matters. Out near the same point there was another, later place, a spit town called Ravenspurn. Do not confuse the two. Ravenspurn earned its own small fame as a landing place for armies. It was here, in 1399, that Henry Bolingbroke came ashore from exile to seize the English throne, and here again, in 1471, that Edward IV landed to win his crown back in the Wars of the Roses. Twice a man stepped off a ship onto this restless edge of Yorkshire and changed who wore the crown of England. But that is Ravenspurn. Our town, Ravenser Odd, is the older one, and by the time those kings were splashing ashore, it was already gone, because the same sea that built Ravenser Odd never once stopped working. This is the bargain nobody in the town ever signed, and nobody could break. A town on a sandbank lives entirely on the goodwill of the tide, and the tide does not keep promises. The very currents that had carried the sand here and piled it up into an island began, just as quietly, to carry that sand away again. The water worked at the edges of the bank, undercutting it, sliding in underneath and eating the ground out from beneath the houses. Sand that took a century to gather can vanish in a handful of bad winters. The boom did not last, because it never could. The town had been built on the one thing in all of England that would not hold still. By the middle of the 14th century, the decline was so plain that the crown sent men to measure it. A royal inquisition in 1346 went out to count what was left of Ravenser Odd, and the verdict was grim. Only a third of the town still stood. 2/3 of everything had already been lost to the sea, gone into the water along with the ground it had stood on. Think for a moment what that means written down in an official survey. The king's men walking a town and writing down plainly that most of it is simply no longer there. And it did not stop. The very next year the records note still more buildings and plots gone, swallowed one by one, house by house and yard by yard. This was the kind of loss you cannot fight, because you cannot fight the ground itself when the ground is dissolving under your feet. There is no wall to man, no enemy to meet at the gate. There is only the slow arithmetic of subtraction, year after year, until the sum runs out. And then we come to the dark heart of this story, the thing that makes Ravenser Odd different from every other town the sea has taken. Because the sea did not stop at the houses. It came for the dead. As the water ate into the island, it reached the churchyard. And one by one it dug the graves open. Coffins were prized out of the sand. Bones came loose and washed up along the shore. Imagine walking the strand of your own dying town and finding the dead of your parish lying uncovered on the beach, turned out of their graves by the tide. It was so terrible, and so far beyond anything ordinary people could deal with, that in 1355 an order came down from on high. The abbot of Meaux, the great abbey inland, was commanded to gather up the disinterred dead of Ravenser Odd, to collect the scattered bones and the coffins the sea had spat back out, and to carry them inland to be reburied in peace at Easington, well away from the water. We even have the words of a man who remembered it. Years later, the abbot of Meaux, Thomas Burton, set the disaster down in his chronicle. He recorded how the sea and the Humber together broke the chapel of Ravenser Odd down to its very foundations, so that the corpses and the bones of the dead there came horribly into the open. A churchman, riding in a quiet scriptorium, reaching for the plainest words he could to describe a place where the ocean had turned a graveyard inside out. Yep. The end, when it came, was quick. In January of 1362, a colossal storm rolled in off the North Sea, the great drowning the chroniclers of the lowlands called the Groot Mandrink, the great drowning of men. It tore along this whole coast and across the sea to Germany and the Low Countries, bursting dikes and swallowing shores. And it finished Ravenser Odd. What was left of the town on the sandbank simply went under, and the sea took back the ground it had lent for barely 100 years. Ravenser Odd was a wild little pirate town on a bank of sand, and the sea unmade it the way it had made it. But the next place the ocean took was no upstart on a sandbank. It was a true city, one of the largest towns in all of medieval England, a place that in its sheer size could stand beside London itself, with churches and monasteries and members of parliament of its own. And almost all of it now lies scattered across the floor of the North Sea. Number 3. Dunwich, Britain's Atlantis. There is a quiet stretch of the Suffolk coast where the cliffs are low and crumbling, and the sea hisses against a shingle beach. A handful of houses, a ruined arch in a field, a single small church. Birds wheel over the marshes inland and a few walkers pass along the shore. It looks like the kind of place where nothing has ever happened. But a few hundred meters out under the gray water, there is a city, a real one. Streets and churches and the bones of a great medieval port, lying on the seabed in the dark. The village you can see is not the town. The town is in the sea. To understand what was lost here, you have to forget the sleepy village and picture Dunwich at its height. Go back before the Normans, and this was a capital. The seat of the kings of the East Angles, one of the oldest and most important places in early England, a center of power when the great cities of later centuries were still villages, and it did not fade with the Saxons. By the 1100s and 1200s, it had grown into something extraordinary. Perhaps 3,000 people lived here at the time of Domesday, the great survey of the conquered land, and at its peak in the 13th century, 5,000 or more. Those numbers sound small to a modern ear, but for the Middle Ages they were enormous. That made Dunwich one of the largest towns in all of medieval England, standing in the same rank as the great cities of its age. And here is the comparison that tells you how big it really was. The town spread out across an area close to that of London in the 14th century. Stop and let that land. A whole city, packed onto the Suffolk cliffs, that covered roughly the same ground as the capital of the kingdom itself. Today there is almost nothing there. Then it was a rival to London in sheer extent. Walk those streets and you would pass something like 18 or 19 churches, monasteries, chapels and hospitals, their towers crowding the skyline above the rooftops, the bells of each one answering the others across the town. Dunwich was rich, it was busy, it was proud. It traded across the North Sea, a great international port the way a major shipping hub is today, handling wool and timber and wine, ships crowding into its sheltered harbor from half of Europe. It was important enough to send its own members to Parliament, to have its own voice in the government of the realm. This was not a village. This was one of the beating hearts of the country. For a time it must have seemed unstoppable. A capital that had outlived the kingdom it once ruled, grown fat on trade, studded with churches, sending its own men to speak for it in Parliament. If you had walked its harbor front in the year 1200, with the masts thick as a forest and the warehouses full, you would never have believed that within a few generations the whole of it would be lying on the seabed. But it was all built on the wrong kind of ground. The cliffs at Dunwich are soft, sand and clay and shingle, the sort of coast the sea can chew straight through. There is no hard rock to hold the line, nothing to break the force of a storm. For most of the year nothing happens. The waves come and go, the town goes about its business, and the danger is easy to forget. And then, on the worst nights, the storms come in off the North Sea and tear away years of land in a single tide. The town did not die slowly and quietly, the way Kenfig was smothered in its sand. Dunwich died in a run of catastrophes, each one taking a great bite out of the city, each one leaving the survivors to count what was gone. The first came on the 1st of January, 1286, when a storm surge breached the town and the sea came in among the houses. The very next year, the floods of 1287 battered the weakened coast again. But the great wound came on the 14th of January, 1328. An enormous storm smashed into Dunwich and destroyed its harbor, the source of all the town's wealth, choking the mouth of the river with shingle and driving it away to the north. Picture what that meant. The ships could no longer get in. The trade that had built the city was cut off at a stroke. A port without a harbor is a town without a future, and Dunwich never recovered the sea traffic it lost that night. And then, in 1347, the same terrible year, the plague would soon reach England. Another great storm swept around 400 houses straight off the cliff and into the sea in one go. 400 homes with their streets and their families, simply gone. After that, Dunwich was dying and everyone could see it. The end did not come all at once. It came slowly, over the centuries that followed, church by church, street by street, edge by edge. One after another, the great churches reached the lip of the crumbling cliff, and one after another they leaned out over the drop and toppled over and fell into the sea, their stones smashing on the shore below. People learned to live with the sound of their own town collapsing, to measure their lives by how many streets still stood between their door and the cliff edge. The monks of the Greyfriars Priory could read the writing on the cliff plainly enough, and they did the only sensible thing. They picked up their priory and physically moved it inland, away from the edge, to ground the sea could not yet reach. The town was retreating from itself, surrendering its own streets to the water year after year, generation after generation, until at last the great medieval city was almost entirely gone, and only the small village we know today was left clinging to the top of the cliff like the last survivor of a shipwreck. And here is where the story turns strange, because the city did not vanish. It is still there. The drowned town of Dunwich does not lie deep in some unreachable abyss, far down in the black where no one can follow. It lies just below the surface, only 3 to 10 meters down, almost close enough to touch. The roof of a sunken city, sitting in the shallows off the Suffolk shore, waiting. And in recent years, a team led by Professor David Sear of the University of Southampton went out over the water to find it. The sea there is so murky and dark that you cannot see anything by eye, even a few feet down, so they did something clever. They mapped the seabed using sound instead of light. They sent out pulses of acoustic energy and listened to the echoes coming back. And from the pattern of those returning sounds they built up a picture of the ruins below, the way a bat builds a picture of a dark room. It is a kind of seeing that needs no light at all, a way to draw a map of the bottom of a blind, black sea. And what came back was a city. They traced the lines of its streets across the seabed, the old roads of medieval Dunwich still laid out in the mud. They found the ruins of the lost churches and named them, building by building. The remains of St. Peter's, All Saints, St. Nicholas, the great religious houses of a vanished town, surveyed and identified and set down on a chart of the bottom of the sea. This work confirmed something genuinely remarkable. Dunwich is the largest medieval underwater town site anywhere in the world. Not a story, not a sailor's guess, but a real city, mapped and measured, lying on the floor of the North Sea where anyone with the right instruments can go and find it. For centuries, long before anyone could map the seabed with sound, people told a different kind of story about Dunwich. They said that on still nights, if you stood on the shore in the dark and listened hard, you could hear the bells of the drowned churches tolling softly under the waves, ringing out across the water for a town that was no longer there. 18 or 19 churches, the legend whispered, all still ringing their hours far below. It is a beautiful tale, and it is important to be honest about what it is. It is exactly that, a folk legend, the romance the living wrap around a place they have lost, the way grief always reaches for something it can hold. There are no bells beneath the water. Nobody has ever truly heard them. But here is the strange and wonderful thing. The churches that the bells supposedly hang in, those are real. The streets are real. The mapped and surveyed ruins on the seabed are as real and solid as the ground you are standing on right now. So keep the two apart in your mind. The legend is the bells, the ghostly tolling under the tide. The fact is the city itself, a genuine medieval town lying mapped on the floor of the sea. Dunwich did not need the legend to be amazing. The truth was always stranger. Dunwich proved that a lost city can be real, that you can sail out over the water and find a true town waiting on the seabed. Which brings us to the most famous sunken city in all of Europe. A place so wrapped in legend that, for hundreds of years, the great question was not where it had sunk, but whether it had ever existed at all. The Atlantis of the Baltic. Number 2. Wolin. The city the world remembers as Saeftinghe. Begin with the legend, because the legend came first, and for hundreds of years it was all anyone had. Somewhere on the Baltic coast, the story says, there once stood a city so rich it shamed every other city on earth. Its gates were made of bronze. Its merchants traded gold the way other men traded bread. Its harbors were thick with ships from every nation under heaven, and its streets ran with wine and silver. And the people of this city, grown fat and proud on all that wealth, forgot God entirely. They grew cruel. They grew greedy. They mocked the poor and worshipped their own riches. And so, the story says, the sea rose up one night to punish them. In a single dark night of storm, the Baltic reached in and pulled the whole golden city down beneath the waves. Towers, treasure, sinful merchants, and all, gone in a few hours, swallowed whole. They called it Saeftinghe, the Atlantis of the Baltic, and the legend has a haunting final touch. On a calm day when the water is still and the wind has dropped, sailors say you can hear it. Far down beneath the surface, faint and slow, the bells of drowned Saeftinghe are still ringing. It is a magnificent story. And for centuries that is all it was. A story. A rich, wicked city, drowned in one night for its pride, lying somewhere under the cold Baltic with its bells still tolling. Mapmakers drew Saeftinghe on the sea and argued about where it lay. Scholars wrote books trying to fix its position, pointing now to one stretch of coast and now to another, the way men will always argue about a place they cannot find. And nobody could prove that it had ever existed at all. It hung there in the mind, this golden drowned city, half history and half ghost, too beautiful to let go of and too vague to ever quite grasp. Now leave the legend behind and go to the real place. Because there was a real place. On the very coast where the legend put its drowned city, at the mouth of the great river Oder in the northwest of what is now Poland, there is an island. And on that island there really was a city. A staggering one. We do not have to imagine it because we have dug it up. Its name in the medieval sources was Jumni or Julin. We would come to know it as Wolin. And for 2.5 centuries, from roughly the year 850 to about 1100, it was one of the largest and richest trading towns on the entire Baltic Sea. Picture it at its height. A long, dense ribbon of a town, stretching some 4 kilometers along the shore. That is further than you could comfortably walk from one end to the other. A wall of timber and smoke and noise unrolling along the water as far as the eye could follow it. Wooden houses crowded together by the thousands. Streets paved with split logs, running down to a busy waterfront where ships were tied up bow to stern. This was not a sleepy fishing village. This was a trading emporium, which is a fine old word for what we would simply call a cosmopolitan port city, a place built for nothing but the buying and selling of goods. A place that lived on commerce, that breathed in cargo and breathed out profit. In its size and its noise and its reach, it stood shoulder to shoulder with the most famous Viking trading towns of the age, with Birka in Sweden and Hedeby in Denmark. These were the great commercial capitals of the northern world, the towns every trader knew. Wolin was their equal, on some days it was their better, and here is the part that makes Wolin extraordinary. Walk its workshops and its markets and you would not have heard one language, you would have heard a dozen. Slavic merchants and Viking merchants, traders from the south and the west, all crowded into the same wooden streets. The town had whole quarters given over to working amber, the golden fossil resin of the Baltic, into beads and ornaments to sell. And when archaeologists came to dig in its soil, they pulled out the proof of just how far this little island reached. They found silver coins struck in the Islamic world, Arab dirhams that had traveled thousands of miles north. They found fine goods from Byzantium, from the great Christian empire on the edge of Asia. They found wares from Western Europe. Think about what that means. A town on a cold northern island was plugged into a single trading network that ran all the way from the markets of Baghdad to the wharves of the Mediterranean. Wolin was a node in something like a medieval global economy, a hub where the wealth of half the known world washed up on a Baltic beach. It was so impressive that it stunned the people who saw it. Around the year 1070, a German churchman and chronicler named Adam of Bremen wrote about this city by the Oder, and he called it, in plain words, one of the largest cities in all of Europe. A great and famous town, he said, where many nations met. Now, we should be honest here. Adam was writing from a distance, repeating what travelers had told him, and like most medieval chroniclers he reached for the grandest words he could find. One of the largest cities in Europe is an exaggeration. Wolin was big, but it was not a rival to Constantinople or Rome. Still, you do not earn that kind of praise by being ordinary. A monk in Germany did not write breathlessly about a town on a far northern island unless that town was genuinely astonishing. The legend of fabulous golden Vinta did not come from nowhere. It came from this, from a real city that really was rich enough to take a chronicler's breath away. So if Wolin was so great, what happened to it? Did the sea really rise up one night and pull it under, the way the legend says? No. And this is the heart of the whole story. Wolin did not drown in a single terrible night. Nothing reached in from the sea and swallowed it whole. The truth is quieter, slower, and in its own way much sadder. Wolin died the way most great places die. By degrees. It died of bad luck and bad water and shifting fortunes, over generations, until one day there was almost nothing left. The first blow came from the very water that had made the town rich. Wolin's whole life depended on its harbor, on the channel called the D Zuna that connected it to the open Baltic. And slowly, year by year, that channel silted up. Sand and mud crept in and choked it, the same patient enemy that buries every river mouth in the end. The deep water grew shallow. The big trading ships that had once crowded the waterfront could no longer reach it easily, and a captain with a hold full of goods will always sail to the harbor that can take him. A port that cannot take ships is no longer a port. It is just a town beside some water, watching the trade go somewhere else. At the same time, the great trade routes themselves were shifting. The rivers of silver from the Islamic world that had flowed north for so long began to dry up and change course, and the patterns of Baltic commerce moved elsewhere, leaving Wolin off to one side. Then came the violence. In the 1170s, Danish raiders fell on the town and burned it, and new towns were rising nearby, hungry rivals like Szczecin and Kamień-Pomorskie, towns with better harbors and brighter futures, and one by one they pulled away the trade that had once flowed through Wolin. The final insult was an administrative one. In the year 1176, the bishopric, the seat of the church, was moved away from Wolin to one of those rivals. When even the church packs up and leaves, you know a place is finished. Silt, war, lost trade, jealous neighbors. No single night. Just a long, grinding decline until the 4-kilometer supercity by the Oder dwindled away into a quiet little town that the world forgot. And now hold the two stories side by side, because here is the shock. For centuries, scholars chased the legend of Winchelsea, the rich, sinful Atlantis drowned in one night, and most of them assumed it was pure fantasy, a sailor's tale with nothing real beneath it. And then archaeologists put their spades into the island at the mouth of the Oder, and they found it. They found the 4-kilometer metropolis. They found the log-paved streets and the amber workshops and the thousands of houses. They found Arab silver and Byzantine treasure lying in the ground. The mythical lost city of the Baltic, the one everybody said was a fairy tale, turned out to have a real medieval supercity buried at its heart. Winchelsea was a dream, but the dream had been dreamed about something true. So what really happened on the Baltic coast? The sea did not swallow Wolin in a night. There was no single dark hour of drowning, no bronze gates vanishing under the waves while the bells rang out. The truth is that sand and war and time did the killing, slowly, patiently, the way they so often do. And that, it seems, was simply too dull for the human heart to bear. People could not accept that so glorious a city had just quietly choked on silt and faded away. So they reached for something worthy of its splendor. They took the slow, undignified death of a real trading town, and they buried it under the waves in a single glorious, terrible night instead. They drowned Wolin in a story, because the truth was too slow to be remembered. Wolin gives us a real supercity hidden inside a legend, a town that declined rather than truly drowned. But there is one place left, one town that earns the name Atlantis more completely than any other on this list. A real medieval town with a real church drowned in a single real night of storm, dismissed as a fairy tale for more than 600 years, and then at last, against every expectation, found. Number 1. Rungholt, the Atlantis of the North Sea. There is one drowned town that every other one on this list is secretly measured against. One name that people reach for when they want to say a place was rich and proud and gone in a single night. For 600 years, Rungholt was the most famous lost town in Europe, and for almost all of that time, nobody could prove it had ever been there at all. Start with the legend, because the legend came first and it lasted longest. The story goes that Rungholt was a great and wealthy city on the North Sea coast, so rich that its people grew arrogant and cruel. And one of the most powerful stories ever told about it has a band of drunken men dragging a pig into a tavern, dressing it in a nightshirt, and demanding that the parish priest come and give the dying animal its last rites, the holy sacrament meant for a Christian soul. The priest fled in horror, And that night the people said, God answered the insult. The sea rose up and swallowed Rungholt whole, every house and every sinner, in punishment for its pride. For centuries afterwards, fishermen working the shallow gray waters off the coast swore that on a quiet day, with the tide low and the wind still, you could hear the bells of the drowned churches ringing far below the water. Mark that down as legend. Hold on to it, because the strange thing about this story is which parts of it turned out to be true. In 1882, a German poet named Detlev von Lilienkron wrote a famous poem about it. And the line everyone remembers is the simplest one. He wrote that today he had sailed over Rungholt, a town that had gone under 600 years ago. Sailed over it, over the empty open water where a city full of people had once stood. That image, a man in a boat drifting across the sky-colored sea above a buried town, is what fixed Rungholt in the imagination of a whole country, the Atlantis of the North Sea, the town that wasn't there. Now leave the legend and look at the real place, because the real Rungholt is even better than the story. It stood on an island called Strand, a flat, wide island of reclaimed marshland off the coast of what is now Schleswig-Holstein in northern Germany. Reclaimed marshland is a hard idea, so hold it plainly. Imagine flat, wet, salty ground that the sea covers at every high tide. Then imagine people throwing up long earth walls around it, draining the water out from behind those walls and farming the dried-out ground that is left. That is reclaimed marsh. Soft new land, won from the sea, with nothing but a wall of packed earth standing between the fields and the water that used to own them. That is what Strand was. That island is gone now too, broken up by later floods into the scattered little islets you can see along that coast today. But in the early 1300s, Strand was solid ground, won from the sea by generations of patient work, and Rungholt was its trading harbor. Picture a busy working port on the edge of the tides. Salt and amber, cattle and grain. Ships coming and going, trading with Flanders and England and far beyond. The dirt of that town still holds broken pottery from the Rhineland, from Flanders, from Spain, even pieces that came from the Islamic world, the everyday rubbish of a place plugged into the whole medieval trade of the northern seas. It was protected by wide earthen dikes, walls of packed soil some 25 to 30 meters across at the base, and it had wooden tidal gates to let the harbor breathe with the sea. We know almost exactly how old those gates were, because the timber can be dated ring by ring and it points to around 1331. This was not a fairy tale. This was an engineered town, perhaps home to somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 people. The sources disagree on the number, so hold it loosely. But a real, prosperous, busy town, on land its own grandparents had taken from the sea. And here is the terrible part. The thing that killed Rungholt was, in part, Rungholt. The land that island stood on was peat. Rich, dark, waterlogged peat, and peat is useful. You can dry it and burn it for fuel. And the briny peat near the coast could be burned in a particular way to get salt out of it, and salt was money. So the people did the obvious thing. They dug it out. They cut into the ground beneath their own fields year after year, hauling up the peat for fuel and for salt, and every time they did, the land settled a little lower. The surface they lived on sank, slowly, season by season, deeper below the level of the rising sea, with only those earthen dikes holding the water off a town that was quietly lowering itself into the grave. They were sawing through the branch they were sitting on, and they could not see it. There was no science that could have told them. They were making good honest money out of the ground, and the ground was carrying them down toward the water an inch at a time. Then came the night, the 15th and 16th of January, 1362. A monstrous storm tide came roaring out of the North Sea, the one the people of these coasts remember by a name that needs no translation. The Groot Mandrink, the great drowning of men. It struck in winter darkness, when there was nothing anyone could do, no warning, no light, no high ground close enough to run to. The wind drove the sea up and over and against those wide earthen dikes, hour after hour, the water rising higher than any dike was built to hold, hammering at the one wall that stood between a sleeping town and the open sea. And somewhere in the black hours of that night the dikes gave way. Not slowly, not over generations the way Kenfig choked on its sand. In hours. The water came through the breach and into a town that had sunk itself below the waves, and it took the harbor and the houses and the great church and the people in their beds, and it did not give them back. By the time the sun came up, Rungholt was under the sea. The storm did not stop at Rungholt. Across the whole of northwest Europe that single night, the Groot Mandrink is reckoned to have killed at least 25,000 people, from England to Denmark, drowning towns all along these low coasts. Keep that number where it belongs as the toll of the whole storm. Around Rungholt itself, in that one drowned corner of the world, the dead may have numbered something like 10,000. A town and its neighbors, gone between dusk and dawn. And then began the long afterlife, the centuries when Rungholt belonged to ghosts. The island of Strand was broken apart. The sea closed over the wreck and smoothed it flat, and where the busy harbor had been there was only the wide, shining, empty mudflat of the Wadden Sea, bare at low tide, drowned again at high. Generations of fishermen worked those waters and swore they heard church bells under the surface. Scholars rolled their eyes. A rich town drowned in one night by the hand of God, with bells ringing under the sea, was exactly the kind of thing that hard-headed men of learning learned to dismiss. A folk tale, a fairy story sailors told. There was no town down there. There never had been. Everyone knew that. Almost everyone. From 1921 onward, a local man named Andreas Busch refused to let it go. He walked the mudflats at low tide year after year, season after season, reading the bare wet ground the way you would read a page, and he began to find things. The lines of old dikes, low and flattened but still there if you knew how to look. The dark squares where buildings had stood, sluices, wells. The footprints of a vanished town, surfacing for a few hours at low water and drowning again with the next tide. He measured them. He mapped them. He was sure he had found Rungholt itself. But traces in the mud are not a town, and for a long time Andreas Busch was a lone seeker walking out into the empty flats after a story that respectable people had already filed away as a myth, a man who believed the fairy tale was a place. And then in 2023, they proved him right. A German team came to the tidal flats near the little island of Sudfall. Archaeologists and geophysicists from Kiel University and other institutes, a group that included Dr. Bent Majczak, Dr. Hannah Hadler, Dr. Dennis Wilkin, and Dr. Ruth Blankenfeld. And instead of walking the surface, they scanned beneath it. They used instruments dragged across the mudflats that could read what lay buried in the ground, the way an X-ray reads what lies inside the body. And out of the mud, in patterns no eye could see from above, the buried town rose up onto their screens. A chain of medieval mounds running 2 kilometers across the flats. 54 settlement mounds, the raised platforms people built their homes on to stay above the tides, spread over more than 10 square kilometers. A sea dike with a harbor, and the wooden tidal gate the legend never knew to mention. And at the heart of it, one foundation larger than all the rest. The footprint of a church around 40 meters long. A church on the scale of a small cathedral, lying flat and silent under the sea, exactly where the fishermen and the legend had always said the town would be. So consider what that means. The fairy tale was true. There really was a great rich town out there under the water. There really was a great church. And the bells that generations of fishermen swore they heard ringing under the cold gray sea, the bells that learned men laughed at for 600 years, belonged to a real building, a real congregation, a real town that the sea took in a single winter night. The sea swallowed Rungholt whole. It took 600 years, but at last we have found the body, lying out there in the shallow water off the German coast, 40 meters of drowned stone where a church once stood. The bells are still down there in the mud. Nobody is laughing now. So there they are. 10 medieval towns that the sea reached out and took for its own. A Norman borough choked to death under the blowing sand of Wales. Lonely church towers left standing on the open beaches of Norfolk. A great English port so completely erased that a king built a brand new town to replace it. A rich Dutch land that soldiers drowned with their own hands. The night the Zuiderzee was born and ate a whole coastline in the dark. A lawless little harbor that the sea pulled apart grave by grave. Britain's Atlantis, mapped in broken pieces on the seabed. The Baltic supercity that hid for centuries inside a legend. And Rungholt, the fairy tale that turned out to be real. Look closely at all of them and the same quiet truth runs underneath. These towns were not destroyed by some strange, once-in-history freak of nature. They were ordinary places, built a little too close to a hungry sea, by people who were certain that their walls and their dikes would hold. For a while, they did hold. And then on one black night or across one slow and patient century, they simply did not. And here is the part that should stay with you. The sea has not stopped. The same water that took Dunwich is still eating that coast today, a little more with every passing winter. The cliffs are still falling. Somewhere out there, right now, there is a town that does not yet know it is on this list. A street, a church, a harbor wall that the water has already quietly decided to take. The Middle Ages only teach us the ending a little early. If you would like to stand on more of these vanished walls with us and wander deeper into the strange, the brutal, and the astonishing corners of the medieval world, then subscribe and stay a while. There is a great deal still down there in the dark, and we have only just begun to go looking for it.